Alright, so I had a false start. I'm pretty sure this is good now. I did just do a little trial run. I'll tell you what happened in just a moment. G'day Burton, I can see you joining, mate. Let me know. Does this sound okay? Does it sound terrible? The problem is, I mean, think about what it's like for all of us, the number of things that you have plugged into your PC, and then I've got two digital to analog, it's early, digital to analog converters, and for some reason the one that the mic is plugged into, the levels were just really peaky. So when I played back the video from just before, I think that's what was happening. So should be okay now. We've got a Yato. Oh, it's Lars, g'day. Oh, it's Richard too. Cheers, mate. Yeah, no, the Aussie accent, I can't do much about that. Alright, yeah, Burton, it should be, what should it be? It should be 256. Don't worry about that. Let's just, can I change that on the fly? What could go wrong? Yeah, let's just change on the fly. 256, save. I'm sure that's fine. Alright, now we're 256. Okay, cool. Let me move on. So, as I was saying before, when I was really peaky, and it's in a video since deleted, it is extra bright in here because of Office improvements. So I've gone through and deleted the curtains. New curtains are coming in. They're very non-acoustically sound. They weren't even curtains, they're blinds, so they weren't very absorbent. So new ones of those coming in. New carpet went in yesterday. That's why everything was unplugged, because I had to take all of my carefully cabled stuff, unplug it all, move the desk, carpet half the room, push back, repeat, etc. So when everything came back, it eventually seems to be okay now. And I still got noise from the other laptop too. So let me do the sponsor thing quickly, because then I've got a heap of stuff on this week's list, and most of it is really controversial too, which I think is actually going to be really good fun. So sponsor this week is Varonis. Reduce your SaaS blast radius. Every time I say blast radius, it just sounds cool. SaaS blast radius with data-centric security for AWS, G Drive, Box, Salesforce, Slack, and more. So big thanks to Varonis for sponsoring again this week. A very long-term sponsor. I think Varonis must be my most frequent sponsor by some margin as well. So thank you very much to those folks. I hope we can do some more stuff together this year. Probably not in person, particularly the way it's going in Australia at the moment. I won't get into that this week because I delved into a bunch of Corona-related stuff last week. Thanks for everyone who is joining in as well. All of this sounds good. Seems like my audio is okay, which is nice. Let's jump straight into all the controversial stuff. So, I did not expect to be, what's the right term? The more, I'm trying not to upset people. I think most people disagreed with me on this one, but let me get through it. We'll just sort of jump into it and see where it goes. Apple and child sexual abuse material, which is on the surface of it not a very fun topic, but an important topic. So this week I shared some content about what Apple is doing in next-gen iOS. Now, let's talk through sort of the technical nature of this and the problem they're trying to solve, and then my position on it, and then why people got upset. I know, people got upset on the internet. It's amazing. So there's a story that I linked to here, which is from Ars Technica. Apple explains how iPhones will scan photos for child sexual abuse images. Now, I think there's a very sort of multifaceted discussion, and there's a bunch of stuff about security, a bunch of stuff about privacy and rights and law enforcement, and what about China? So let's try and unpack it all in no particular order. And I think the easiest place to start is sort of the technical side of it. So basically what Apple is doing is saying that there are signatures of known we'll just call it CSAM for the sake of simplicity. There are signatures of known CSAM images. When we talk about signatures, we're largely talking about hashes. So if you imagine you've got a photo of something, that photo has a hash representation which would allow you, should the same photo be seen somewhere else, to generate a hashed representation and compare the two. Now you can have a great big database of all the hash representations without actually having all the nasty images. And then if a nasty image appears somewhere and you're able to reapply that same hash process and then compare the two, you can go, that image is almost certainly one of the ones which is a known bad image. Now, we say almost certainly because we could have, say, hash collisions. We could have multiple different images that create the same hashes. Now, Apple believes that their ability to do this gives them a 1 in 1 trillion false positive rate. Pretty good odds. I mean, if you had a 1 in 1 trillion chance of winning the lottery, would you? Oh, some people probably would play because your odds are practically zero anyway. But you know what I mean? Like 1 in 1 trillion, that seems reasonable. I don't think anyone's going to say, well, I'm really, really worried that this is likely going to lead to all these false positives. Now, that, I guess, is the first bit. I like the idea of Apple saying we are going to be able to look at photos and see if they match known bad ones without actually looking at the photos themselves. Where it gets really, really curly is in order to do this, what Apple is saying, and I only know what I read as well. I've only gone through news articles, I haven't gone through any sort of deep papers or anything on this, but what appears to be happening is they're saying when you have photos on your device and they are synced to iCloud, on the iCloud side, they are able to then create those hashes and compare to the known bad ones. And this is where people start to get very worried privacy-wise, because we've got a situation here where Apple is saying we're going to, in some form, look at your photos. Now, of course, this is not like an Oompa Loompa sitting there like looking at all your personal photos, right? This is literally software going through creating hashes, but the fact remains that they need access to your photos. I think one of the things that sort of surprised me a little bit is that people are surprised that if you put your photos on iCloud, then the provider of iCloud might have access to the photos. So, there's that aspect of it too. A lot of the concern from people comes from, number one, that side of thing. But again, it's like this is literally the way it works. You're syncing this stuff backwards and forwards through their cloud. There's no expectation of end-to-end encryption on this either. This is not like a WhatsApp or an iMessage communication. That is going into the cloud in a way that is retrievable. A lot of the concern I've heard is people have said, it's a slippery slope. You heard slippery slope the whole time. So it's a slippery slope because what's going to happen is they're going to start with CSAM images and then it's going to be something else. Or what if a government that we don't agree with, and I assume when they say we, it's going to be people more from Western Hemisphere, government we don't agree with compels Apple to use it to find something else. Because there are governments in the world that do things that we don't like from our part of the world. Slippery slope. Now, I just think there's multiple layers of problems with this. One of the layers of the problems is this: the slippery slope argument is always predicated on saying, here is what a piece of technology does. It does this. It could be used to do something totally different in the future. Because it might do something totally different later on, we shouldn't use it to do this one thing now. And I kind of lost patience with some of the tweets, and I sort of went back and went, if you're saying that later on, if this thing does something totally different to what it does, and that totally different thing might not be good, then yes, I agree, but it doesn't do that totally different thing, it does this other one thing. And the problem that we kind of have here, and this will come up later on when I talk about the AirTags as well, is the moral neutrality of the technology, where the ability to do things like look for known bad images can be used for what we would classify as good, and I think most of us would classify identifying CSAM as good. It could also be used for what we might classify as bad, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. Just by pure coincidence, I was listening to something on the radio this morning. It was an interview with an ethicist, and the way they describe these particularly different cultural views of ethics is really, really interesting. So one of the examples that comes up is in Russia, Apple removed the gay pride watch face. Now, is that an abuse of the power they have and that they control the watch faces you have? I would argue, and I think most people listening to this probably argue, that you should be able to have whatever bloody watch face you want. But Russia takes a very, very different view of things. And the problem you then end up with is if you want to do business in a country like Russia, if Apple wants to do business in a country like Russia, and particularly if Apple wants to do business in a country like China, they do need to adhere to the local laws as well. So now you end up in a situation going, we in Australia, the UK, the US, where most of us are, Western Europe, think that there should be equal rights for everybody and you should be able to have whatever watch face you want. That is our view. There is a different part of the world where the government takes a different view. Now, what should Apple do? Do they go, no, screw you, we're going to keep the gay pride watch face, and then potentially be booted out of the market or have some other sort of penalty? And then particularly when you get to China, when it comes to government oversight, well, what does Apple do there? Do they kill the world's largest economy, second largest economy, depending on how you measure it, kill their market share there, or do they adhere to the local laws? And even then, the whole morality discussion is very subjective in different parts of the world. So anyway, I don't think I can answer that. I think that would be a good one for the ethicist. I was listening to this morning as to whether or not Apple should have the ability to do that, or Microsoft or Google or Amazon or any of the big ones. But the point we're making here is that there is a difference between abuse of the power independently as a technology organisation and adhering to local laws in order to actually do business in the place. And inevitably, there are some parts of the world where technology companies just go, no, we're not going to adhere to local laws. The main one that comes to mind is Mozilla saying, no, we're not going to install Kazakhstan's root certificate in our browsers and allow everybody to be effectively intercepted for all their traffic by the Kazakhstani government. That doesn't sound very cool. Don't know how lucrative the Kazakhstani market is. So that might be a case where they can take an ethical stance without the financial burden that would happen if they did that in somewhere like China. So there's that. Now, the other thing, if we just get back to the parts of the world that are more familiar to most of us as well, is that all of these tech companies are increasingly facing pressure to do more to crack down on illegal activity on their platforms. Now, terrorism is always the big one, right? Where people say, let's say US senators, US senators say, we shouldn't have a situation where terrorists or pedophiles can communicate with each other using end-to-end encryption. Technology companies need to do something about this. And the headline then normally turns into backdoors and encryption. And as soon as they talk about that, then everyone talks about the clipper chip. If you don't know what that is, Google it and get the background. And this is a really difficult problem where we again come back to the moral neutrality of technology. So I can have an end-to-end encrypted chat with Charlotte about what we're having for dinner. And I have the same privacy as someone having an end-to-end encrypted chat as, let's say, a journalist reporting on some human rights violation or a pedophile sharing imagery. And this is the problem. Everybody gets privacy, and because of the moral neutrality of encryption, we all get that same right to privacy. But the problem is that it does actually make it very hard on law enforcement. So think about what it used to be like back in the day. Now, having never been in law enforcement, I'm speculating here, but I've watched a lot of James Bond. So someone can sit there on a telephone line and listen to communications backwards and forwards. There is legal process for that. It's different parts of the world. But it can be done as part of law enforcement efforts. Now you have a situation where it's easier than ever to have end-to-end encrypted chats. And regardless of whether or not you agree on there should be backdoors or not, and I do not think there should be in any way, shape and form, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Regardless of how you view that, you can't argue against the fact that it does make it very hard for law enforcement to do their work. And a lot of that work is to our benefit. Most of that work is to our benefit. That's kind of the point of it. It's like, I like not being blown up. Like, that is a very, very important part of my daily life. So what role does a tech company have? And the pressure they're getting from government, and they're getting this a lot from all the governments. I mean, we've certainly been headline news here in Australia. We've seen senators like Lindsey Graham in the US as well being very, very vocal about this. The pressure they're getting is come up with a solution. Now, this looks like part of their solution. The solution being is that it doesn't break encryption, it doesn't backdoor, there's no master key. They're literally saying we're going to identify CSAM imagery when it sits there on a server and it matches what we know is CSAM imagery without having to actually look at the images themselves. So keep in mind that part of this is trying to satisfy that concern from lawmakers about how do we crack down on things like pedophilia. My fear is that if the likes of Apple, and I keep saying the likes because obviously it's not just them. I mean, what do we got? Apple and Google, big players with mobile devices, obviously Microsoft as well, and then we've got Amazon with all of, well, Amazon's up and everything these days. If the tech companies can't provide solutions to this, or at least partial solutions to this, the risk we run is being regulated in ways which really are detrimental to all of us, being regulated in ways where maybe the privacy controls we have so that when we're talking about the shopping no longer exist. So this seems like a reasonable step towards satisfying regulatory requirements in a way that also preserves privacy. Let me read the comments. Richard, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. Melvin, well, where does that leave it? What's left? What else is in here? Ismaka says, confusing. It involves iCloud, but then Apple's statement says instead of scanning images in the cloud, the system performs on-device matching a database of known CSAM hashes. Now, there is another nuance to this. And again, I've only read what I see in the news here. There also appears to be another piece, which is also, let's see if they actually use the word parental in this Ars article. Here you go. Changes roll out later this year to iOS 15, which I believe should be next month, actually. WatchOS, macOS. Apple will also deploy software that can analyze images in the Messages application for a new system that will, quote, warn children and their parents when receiving or sending sexually explicit photos. Now, here's my reading of this, and someone tell me if I've got this wrong or if they've seen more detail on it. These seem to be two parallel things which for the most part are unrelated. The CSAM stuff is looking at known hashes of exploitative material for something that is outright atrocious and illegal absolutely everywhere. And we want those bastards caught. We're just trying to do it in a way that doesn't destroy the privacy of everybody else. There is this other bit when we talk about children and parents and sexually explicit material. There's plenty of sexually explicit material out there which is perfectly legal. Okay, a lot of it isn't as well, or is a bit borderline, particularly when we're talking about kids sharing images. But let's say for the sake of argument, it is legal pornography. But what we're talking about now is parental controls. So should children be able to share this information backwards and forwards without any oversight from parents? Now, Apple actually has some really, really good parental controls. So both my kids have hand-me-down devices which sit under my account, and my parental controls mean that they can't go and buy apps on the store without my approval. They have screen time limits, so they can't just sit there all day and play on their iPhones. All sorts of other parental oversight things. There is the ability, it's not one that I use, but there is the ability to control their contacts list and who they can chat to. I think the idea of being able to say, hey, little Johnny is sharing material which appears to be sexually explicit is not a bad thing. So long as there's then the ability for me as a parent to make a ruling decision on whether or not it was, and maybe little Johnny and I got to have a chat about what he's doing. I like that idea. I think, again, that the challenge here is possibly false positives, but if it's literally just false positives between you, let's say it's, they were down at the beach or something and taking a photo of their mates doing backflips, I don't know, whatever. And that gets flagged as a false positive, but you as a parent, you get an alert and you go, okay, well, all right, that's not actually a bad thing, that's fine, you can keep doing your backflips. But I think there's a very, very different piece of the puzzle, and particularly because this does appear to happen on device, not in cloud, it's just a parental notification. That seems to be a completely different thing to the CSAM thing. It's just reported here in the same article. I did have someone make a comment along the lines of, this is invasive to the child's privacy. It's like, yeah, well, that's what you do as a parent. You invade the child's privacy. This is literally why we have all of this like expert guidance about don't let your children, particularly younger children, use devices unsupervised. Have them in a public place. Make sure you can see what they're doing. Make sure they know that you can see all of their messages, which is precisely what I tell all my kids. All my kids, or two of them. So all of this is really, really, I think, a normal part of parenting, and not to be confused with the CSAM stuff. All right, what else is in here? Burton, do you think Windows will implement the same as Apple on those lucrative Windows phones, perhaps? On the other devices, such as on a Windows PC? It's a good question. Bits and pieces. I mean, I can see at the moment, so the kids also have Windows PCs. They are part of my family account. I can see via the parental controls which websites they're going to. So that bit exists. As for the CSAM bit, I don't know. It's a good question. Maybe that will depend on how all this pans out with Apple. And just to be clear as well, there's one other nuance in here. Now, this is the bit that I'm literally going on hearsay with, but my understanding is that the database of hashes of CSAM material isn't a US government database. Apparently there are NGOs or an NGO, I'm not sure which one it is, that maintains this list, and they do the world a service by having these hashes that are available for people. So this doesn't seem to be something where at someone's discretion they can start saying, let's say for argument's sake, we are going to add images of Tiananmen Square into this particular database. That doesn't seem to be that sort of case. I know that's what people are concerned about. Again, local laws, whole other discussion here. In fact, the Tiananmen Square is a good example. So try, okay, probably none of us are going to China anytime soon, but try even looking at some of the news articles about what do you see if you do a Google search for Tiananmen Square from Hong Kong versus from just about anywhere else in the world. You see something totally different. That's not accidental. That is Google obviously tailoring results based on instruction from Chinese government. So a good example of where governments are instructing tech companies to adhere to their local laws, whether we like them or not. Big Pod says, problem I see is that in theory, Apple or Google, whoever, could police their users according to companies' views of right and wrong. Yes, this is possible. Now, there's another interesting angle to this as well, where I saw people saying, you really have to trust Apple. You have to trust them not to abuse this. I'm going, you've got an iPhone, right? The iPhone has your location, your movement. It knows the websites you go to. It knows what you're saying. It has your photos. It has so much personal... I mean, imagine if you had access to everything on someone's iPhone. You already put a huge amount of trust, into Apple. And if you don't trust them to have all those things, you should go and use, I don't know what, do you then have to trust Google to do all those things correctly with Android? So the premise that somehow this requires a new level of trust in a provider that already has extremely privileged access to your most personal things in your life, it just doesn't kind of pass the bullshit test. Not for me, anyway. Big Pod says, I'm really sad for those kids. For me, my device and accounts were always private and always under my personal password code. Nobody in my family knew. Well, I got to be a child and then become an adult before the internet and before mobile devices. And okay, this is going to be a very personal thing that's different for different people, but my view of it is that, let's say my daughter, she's 9 years old. She is not mature enough to be able to have privacy insofar as do whatever she wants on the internet and I don't get to see it. Have whatever conversation she wants with her friends and I don't get to see it. That is just not an age where that should be happening. And there are reams and reams of material to that effect. I do not believe in that at all. The premise that somehow children should have complete privacy from parents, particularly at that age, it just does not fly. And I think most people with kids would probably have the same sort of view. Now, I hear some people say, well, when the kids are old enough to decide for themselves, they should be able to decide, and the parents shouldn't be dictating these things. Well, parents would dictate all sorts of things. We dictate what school you go to. We dictate when you can go and have a sleepover with a friend. I certainly dictate what they eat. Imagine if my kids could just decide to eat whatever they want to eat. With your kids, it'd all be like ice cream and chocolate and they'd be obese. So no, parents have a huge amount of responsibility and they get to make a lot of the choices. And particularly choices around how children engage with other kids is really important. My kids are going to see porn, I've got no doubt about that. But I really want to keep control on that, particularly at their ages. They're 9 and 11 at the moment. They're at an age where they do not understand the social impacts of all of that. So I want to be part of that. And we get that reinforced a lot from the schools as well. Schools are very, very clear. Kids shouldn't have social media accounts until I think they're pretty much aligned with COPPA here around the 13 years of age. They shouldn't be left unattended on mobile devices, all the rest of it. Mike says Internet Watch Foundation. So is that the foundation that does the CSAM stuff? That sounds feasible. Question here. Are those hashes resilient to recompression and or minor edits? So there's the answer is I'm not sure. One would imagine that there would be some level of editing of images which would change the hashes and no longer match. And one of the one of the arguments I've heard against this technology is people have said, well, one of the things I hear a lot, so I said, well, it will just force it underground. People go underground. Well, good. That's what we want. It's the same argument about if you remove this neo-Nazi website from the clear web, they'll just go underground. Great. It's going to be harder to find. This is what we want. We want the stuff to be harder to find. We want the barrier to entry to be higher. Now, if the barrier to entry means that you can't just exchange these photos anymore, not in their raw format without a high likelihood of being caught, and you have to go through extra processes to modify them and obfuscate them, then good. This doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to make it a lot harder and to make people much more likely to be caught if they do it. And not just that, but make them fearful that they're going to be a lot more likely to be caught if they do it. Trent says, Trent Apple, there you go. Trent Apple's e-service is beneficial, but you have to trust them to take advantage of it. We just kind of made the point about trust. Mitch says, safe to say everyone is already gathering everything they can from the phones. That they can. I think where the battle lines, as they say, seem to be getting drawn is Apple is consistently taking a very privacy-centric stance, which is sometimes been a very subtle dig at Google, sometimes been a lot more overt dig at Google. Obviously, Google has a huge amount of revenue from profiling people and being able to target content at them, whereas Apple has a huge amount of revenue from selling physical devices and buying you into the Apple ecosystem. So I do feel that Apple is in a position to take a more privacy-centric stance. Richard says, Azure Photo Storage already has serious restrictions on certain files like CSAM. That comes back to the question before about will Microsoft do something similar? Stephen, time to update. Santa Claus is coming to town. Google, Apple knows when you're sleeping. Yeah, pretty much. Questions here about how old you should be. I think we kind of covered that. Let's move on to the other controversial Apple topic. This one I think is really fascinating. I wondered when these two worlds were going to collide, because there are two things this week about Apple AirTags. One was very against it, one was very for it. And I read the one that was very against it, and I was like, I can see where you're coming from, however. And I'll come back to what that is in a moment. And then I read the one that was very for it, and I was like, this is really cool, and I shared it, and next minute someone's sharing the one that's very against it. So let's talk about the one that's very for it. So this is a thread from Dan Guido. And Dan Guido is a fairly notable identity in the security industry. And basically, it starts like this. He says, my scooter was stolen last week. Unknown to the thief, I hid 2 AirTags inside it. I was able to use the Apple Find My network and UWB direction finding to recover the scooter today. Here's how it all went down. Anyway, Dan does a pretty cool thread here because he's got lots of photos of the scooter and outside his apartment where it was stolen from. And the long and the short of it is that he secreted 2 AirTags in his scooter. Someone stole his scooter and he was able to track it down. And he sort of explains why he has 2 there and why he hid one a bit more discreetly than the other one. And then also talks about the fact that they end up turning up at this place where it's obviously a shop that's just selling stolen goods, and these people trying to talk themselves out of it. He gets the cops involved as well. So I guess it was sort of a happy story. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop the Twitter thread here into the chat window for those interested. I liked this because I think we all like the idea of screwing crooks. You know, like regardless of what your perspective is on privacy and all the rest of it, screwing crooks, great, love it. This was a really, really good use case. Now, I'm just going to read the other one. I'll read the start of the other one because it will give you the 2 sort of sides of the story. I'm going to drop this thread into the chat window as well. So this is from a lady who says, I think her name, Meadow Alice is her Twitter handle. Not a Meadow is her Twitter handle. Meadow Alice her name. Apple's AirTags is the worst idea ever. Exactly the kind of I'd expect from a young, inexperienced team from an SV startup. Now you, a random human, need to download an app on your Android phone to see if someone slipped one into your bag in a pub last night. Now, she does have a very good point here, which is the ability to stalk. And her concern here is because Apple AirTags are small, so they're sort of the size of a coin, And because by design they track where they go, if a stalker was to slip one onto your being at somewhere like a nightclub and then you go home, then they could see where you go. And that is a really worrying thing. And we're back to moral neutrality. So remember that the macro premise here, the macro premise is to have a device which is small and discreet and can be found again even when it leaves your field of vision or your field of RF or whatever else it is. It could be anywhere in the world. You can see where it is, which is great if you lose your luggage or, in Dan's case, his scooter. So the problem with the moral neutrality is that this can obviously be abused. Now, this is not the first time this concern has been raised with AirTags, and also AirTags are not the first thing we've had. We've had tiles for ages. Anyone got a tile? Tiles are like, I don't have an AirTag yet, but I imagine they're like a crappier AirTag for various reasons. But I used tiles for years, particularly when I used to travel. And they'd be little tags you could put on your keyring, you could put in your luggage. And anyone running the tile app would become a beacon, so that when that tile moved around the world, anyone running the tile app, and I assume that there were a very large number of people using it because I could track my luggage around the world, the little tile would beacon to that person and whoever's running the app, and you could see where your tile is in the world. So this is not new. We've had this for ages. What Apple has done to mitigate this, and this is where I feel it's a little bit like the CSAM discussion, where they're like, morally neutral, has a lot of upside, we need to mitigate the risk of abuse. The risk of abuse is, it seems that if an AirTag is near an Apple device for a period of between, and they don't say exactly, it seems to be like between 8 and 24 hours, and it's following it. So for example, if someone does slip one into your pocket and your Apple device sees it, your Apple device will warn you, and I believe the AirTag actually makes a noise as well. Now, of course, this is a double-edged sword, right? Because imagine it's Dan's scooter and the thing starts beeping. It seems like, based on his thread, this is what happened. You could be like tipping the bad guys off, that someone's trying to track your scooter. But you could also be this lady and be getting tipped off that someone slipped an AirTag into your bag because they're trying to stalk you. So this is sort of like their mitigating control. I think a lot of her issue here is that iPhones do this by default. You need to have a third-party app for an Android. So imagine she's an Android user and someone slips an AirTag into her bag, unless she's running that Apple app, unless she's got an iPhone, she's not going to know about it. Or unless she's running the Apple app, that's what I was going to say, Apple app on her Android. But I'm just not sure that the Android thing fully stacks up anyway, because what if there are other people, let's say she lives in an apartment, other people in the apartment that have an iPhone, she passes them. And again, like this is not just an AirTag thing. What if it is a tile and someone else has got the tile app? You've got the same problem. She's very upset about this, and I kind of see where she's coming from, but there's a bit in here about Tile. Plus, I'm answering this a lot. Tile relies on crowd tracking or BT range, so does AirTag, but everyone's iPhone is part of the tracking network, so do the maths of probabilities. And yes, there are other ways to track people. I don't need to be schooled on that, trust me. It's still the same problem though, isn't it? Because the tile network is so comprehensive, you still get a good idea of where your tile is. Like, that's what actually made tile good. It's like so many people were using it. The more people that used it, the better it became. Let's just go to the comments. Richard Campbell says, I put a tile on my old dog. Nice. Someone here is just a dash says, would anyone really do that? If the AirTag was found, the police would likely be able to find out who bought the AirTag. That's actually a reasonable point too. Well, there's several things there. So first of all, there's a financial commitment, but then again, a tile or an AirTag is cheap. What is it, $20 or something like that? But then if it does actually tie back to an individual, I could imagine someone trying to talk their way out of it. It's like, oh, thank you found my tile. I knew I lost it in someone else's handbag at the nightclub. Oh, maybe you stole my tile. What about that? So yeah, Trent Apple says, especially an extra, more concealed AirTag. Similar in ways to the concept of a honeypot with a more visible AirTag. Fritz says, Dutch e-bike maker Van Moof, great bikes, sell their bikes with the technology built in. I was having this discussion with Charlotte this morning over breakfast, and she mentioned that. So what if it was built in? The only challenge I could see there is that if you know that a particular brand has it built in, then I would imagine the first thing you would do is go, okay, I'm going to go to the chip or the radio or the whatever it is which is emitting the signal, and I'm just going to disable that before I take it home. I think the nice thing about the AirTags is you just never know if it's going to be there or not. You never know where it's going to be. Trent says a tile AirTag is arbitrary based on proximity. You do not necessarily know what it is attached to, but when they're close enough for a long time, you ought to be aware. It is an interesting one, isn't it? And we come back again to the same discussion with encryption, the same discussion with the CSAM hash matching, where we can use the technology to do good things, we can use it to do bad things. What I will say, in fact, I meant to say this on the CSAM bit. One of the things that did upset me a little bit with the narrative there is that you tend to get people that have very strong views at either end of the scale, representing those views very vocally. Let's take the CSAM thing. It is terrible. It will erode privacy. That sucks. And then you get the politicians at the other end of the scale. It's like, stop pedophilia at all costs. It's like, well, neither of those statements is really correct. And my feeling is that anyone who's making these arguments in absolute terms and not seeing the other side is really doing a little bit of a disservice to the whole debate, because we're not seeing the thing in a rational, holistic way. I decry the number of people that replied to that thread of mine purely negatively and not at one point said, yeah, like it would be good to reduce the distribution of CSAM material. Let's try and find ways to do it. Or here is a better way of doing it. So it's not people saying, let's not do it this way, that doesn't work very well. Here's something else that would actually be a really good solution. It's like, no, we don't like this, so we should throw it out because it is not perfect. So I think these absolute discussions are really not healthy. All right, let me move on. Something totally different. Not controversial at all. Turkish government on Have I Been Pwned. Mostly not controversial. So Turkish government is now the 26th government on Have I Been Pwned to have access to all of their government domains via API for free. Their national cert is in there. They join a whole bunch of others, UK, Australia, US, the Netherlands, Jamaica. I really want to go and visit those guys. Never been to Jamaica. Or the Caribbean. I think that'd be cool. Almost completely non-controversial. I did get one person emailing me not happy about Turkey's support for ISIS, was his view of it. I got similar feedback about Israel, not ISIS support, sort of the opposite direction. It was more Palestinian stuff. When the Israeli government came on, the view I take with all this is that there's one easy way of looking at it to begin with, which is simply that we have export controls that are defined by our Department of Foreign Affairs and Travel in Australia. There are certain countries that we simply cannot do various things with, including provide IT services in some cases. Israel is not one of them. Turkey is not one of them. And if there was a country that matched that criteria, well, then like literally legally I can't do that. The other part of it is that this is something that all countries have access to anyway, insofar as if you control a domain and you can demonstrate you control a domain, you can go and do a free search on Have I Been Pwned right now. Yes, this does make it easier and it does give them support, primarily to try and help governments do their job better, because for the most part they're there trying to keep us safe when we're talking about national certs. I'm just simply not in a position to get down into the nitty-gritty of, do I agree with this government's politics or not? I mean, if we go back to the discussion before about Russia and the gay pride icon on the watch, or China taking very different views of things like privacy and human rights, it is a very, very, very tricky geopolitical thing, which is really not my expertise. Okay, that said, let's move on to something not controversial at all. I just tweeted this morning. Oh boy, this upset some people. Firefox 91 and HTTPS. I think this is fascinating. And then I'm going to talk about why I know HTTPS, because it just, by coincidence, times in really well. Firefox 91 gets HTTPS default in private mode and enhanced cookie clearing in Windows single sign-on. Now this is this is quite interesting. I'm just going to find the bit that I quoted here. When users use a private window in Firefox, the connection to the requested domain will now default to HTTPS, even if a user manually enters the HTTP protocol. An HTTPS first request will also be made if the user clicks on an HTTP link. So basically secure all the things. Now, this is good, and all the arguments against it are wrong, and I'll explain why in a moment. We're rapidly pushing forward towards an HTTPS by default web. So Chrome will have an option to force HTTPS and then show big warnings. I think it's Chrome 92 that hits later next month? Chrome 94, I think, hits later next month, which will have that option. We are seeing increasingly obvious visual indicators, negative visual indicators for sites that are insecure. It started by seeing little warning signs if you had a password field or something on an insecure web page. It's gotten more overt over time. Firefox 91, I tweeted a link to what that looks like because I fired this up about an hour ago. It is a large interstitial page which says you're going to go to a page insecurely. Are you sure you really want to go? Then there's a button down there where you can go. So really, really, really important thing here. This is not breaking HTTP. It's not killing HTTP. You can still go to HTTP insecurely. The browser tells you you're about to go to HTTP insecurely. Are you sure you want to do that? When you think about them doing this in private mode, it does seem to make sense insofar as people usually go into in private mode when they have a higher expectation of privacy. Now, that might be because they don't want the tracking cookies from somewhere else following them, and that might be because they don't want it in their history. All of that is absolutely fine. I think it is a very reasonable assertion to say that people wanting that extra level of privacy would also like someone sitting in the middle of the connection, not to see where they're going. That seems quite reasonable. So I don't have a problem with this. The responses I saw earlier on today, which is frankly kind of weird. Now, I won't name people individually, but there are a couple to this effect. You can look at the response to the tweet where they was like, I am in control of the browser. It is my decision as the user. I should issue all the commands and instruct the browser exactly what to do, and it should follow my commands. And if it doesn't, it sucks, and that's morally wrong. I don't know, ethically wrong, something wrong. Now, the problem with this, and we've had this discussion so many times with other particularly HTTPS-related initiatives from the browser, is that how many people use a browser? How many billion is it? It's some number of billions. Let's just agree on that. Some number of billions of people use the browser. And Mozilla and Google and whoever else still makes a browser all need to make decisions about how do we implement controls that work the best for the most people. Now, if I was to ask my parents and said, look, if you explicitly type in an HTTP address, do you expect it to be loaded over the insecure scheme, or would you be upset if it upgraded to the secure scheme? I'm not going to get a very good reply, because my parents are representative of the well over 90% of people that use a web browser, which is they enter a URL and they just expect it to work, and that's it. And they don't think about anything more. They don't think about the plumbing behind it. So the browsers are helping people make the right decisions, even if they don't have to think about it. If my parents do enter over the HTTP scheme, this will fix that for them, if they're in private mode, of course. As we move forward into Chrome 94, if you enable the feature to force secure browsing, it will do the same thing. At some point in the future, I have no doubt whatsoever that all browsers will do that by default, whether you're in private or incognito or whatever. It'll do that by default. And this is fine, because we're defaulting to privacy. Now, to be clear, as I mentioned before, you can still go to that website over HTTP if you really want to. In fact, I used an example of Dave Weiner's website. Google it, it's interesting. Which I tried to go to over HTTP. It does not support HTTPS at all. And I was still able to do that. Now, I appreciate there's a little bit of a gap here, which is what if there is a website that supports HTTPS, but I really want to go there over HTTP? Well, you can. If you're not in private mode in Firefox, it will do that. If you're on a current version of Chrome, it will do that. There is a question then at some point in the future as browsers start to default more and more to HTTPS. What will happen then? I expect this will be toggleable. Now, I haven't even looked at Firefox in terms of the Firefox settings. I literally just pulled down and updated just today, but if I go into settings, I'm sure there's probably going to be something in HTTPS which is like, don't automatically force HTTPS. HTTPS only mode. Oh, here you go. HTTPS only mode. HTTPS provides a secure encrypted connection between Firefox and the websites you visit. Most websites support HTTPS. You know who you are if you don't. And if HTTPS only mode is enabled, then Firefox will upgrade all connections to HTTPS. You can check the box that says don't enable HTTPS only mode. So if for whatever reasons, be they philosophical or whatever other weird reasons there are, you don't like this, then disable it. But understand that you are this tiny speck of a minority of people who would actually want to do that. It is an exceptional edge case, and you're probably wrong. All right, let me have a look at the comments in here. I'm going to move past the AirTags just to keep us moving forward. Stephen says, at what point will it be quicker or easier to list all the countries that aren't using HOBP? Congratulations, by the way. I would say after about another 75, assuming there's a couple of hundred odd countries around the world. Troy couldn't have picked any more controversial topics. Oh, yes, I could have. Trust me, I could have. But I am a little bit selective. Big Pod says, someone asked me why I use Edge instead of Firefox. And I said that among other reasons, there are security problems like ID and homographs. That is a very interesting edge case, and that's the difference between Firefox and Chrome as well. At least it was a little while ago. But I'm happy for Firefox to get HTTPS default, but it should be outside a private window. I suspect that it will be everywhere in a while. And again, Chrome 94, later next month, I believe, is the schedule for that. You can go and grab the Canary build now if you want to see what it looks like. There is an option to enable the same thing, not just in incognito, but all the time as well. Stephen says, I guess the reason is to test secure for incognito before making it more default outside it, but I reckon it's only a matter of time. So that, I guess whether it's just the incognito bit here, or the in private, as I call it in Firefox bit here, or going into Chrome 94 and actually having a toggle, usually these things start to become available as options. Very often, Google does this a lot with Chrome, it will be drip fed out to users of Chrome. In fact, I've had so many times in workshops where some people in the audience will have some behavior of Chrome which other people won't, because they are part, unbeknownst to them, they're part of the sample set, which is effectively being A/B tested, and they've got like the future feature just to see how they react, and everyone else has something different. So it will trickle out, absolutely. Mike says, since the Tunisian government MITM attacks on its nation's Facebook users, has there been another example of a large-scale HTTP traffic interception? Just out of interest. Good question. CoinHive, but that wasn't government. So CoinHive was installed on a bunch of Microtech routers, which then injected CoinHive crypto miner JavaScript libraries into browsers. Not government, though. Are you asking government? Yeah, you're asking government. It would be really interesting to look at the China piece. Actually, I can think of a couple of examples. There was, in India, I think it was Airtel in India, because the Pirate Bay was using Cloudflare, but they were only encrypting from the browser to the Cloudflare edge node and not from the edge node back to the origin. Airtel were able to, I'm pretty sure they were I'm just going to Google this, pretty sure they were injecting something into the connection. Airtel, Pirate Bay. Pirate Bay Cloudflare. I'm sure this will give a result. Airtel is sniffing and censoring Cloudflare's traffic. So this is 2016. So Mike, I'm just going to drop that in the comments. Have a read of that. That's another one that came immediately to mind. I'm sure there are many others that I can't think of just immediately off the top of my head. Trent Apple says, if an individual thinks it is their right, then maybe they can write their own browser or customize the defaults. And this is what I ended up saying to someone. I was like, this person was adamant that they as the user should dictate the way the software writes. I'm like, no, that's not how software works. Someone creates a product, and then you may use the product if you want to. If you don't want to, go and use someone else's. By the way, they're all going to do this over time. But short of there being configurability, which there is in Firefox, this is the way the thing works. Get over it. Stephen says, default secure means if you really don't want, for whatever reason, you'll have to learn how to do it, and maybe in the process realize why it's a bad idea not to use HTTPS. The gap that I can still see, less of a problem at the moment because most of us aren't traveling at all, but what happens to captive portals? You know, when you join a Wi-Fi network and it wants to pop up a captive portal and say, hey, you need to like read all the terms and conditions of this hotel and agree to that before we will then allow your connection through to the internet. But then again, most of the time when you do that, the client will pop up a known HTTP address served by that manufacturer. So I imagine you could just put that on an allow list somewhere. And I really wish we had a better way of doing that, because that's super sucky. PomTom44, only case I can see you would want to do it is for old web interfaces on like network switches and stuff where they don't run HTTPS, but you still need access to it. Well, again, this is where you can still fall back to HTTP. I mean, a really good example is if I access, let's say I access one of my Shellys here on the local network. Now, mind you, these are local IP addresses, which would usually be considered an exception. But if I had a host name mapped to one of my Shelly IoT devices on a local network, there is no certificate on that device. It is on my local network. I'm not too worried about that. But yes, I still need to be able to go there in securely. But I don't mind an interstitial page saying, you're going to go there in securely. Are you sure? Yeah, fine. Okay, then go. Richard says there's 203 countries with the creation of South Sudan. No requests yet from South Sudan. That I feel like that might be one where I have to go and look at that DFAT advisory if they pop up. Burton says there's so much hate with any changes to their control, but the decision is right. I think it's time to move on to HTTPS by default. Honestly, I just get to the point with people where I'm like, you don't like it? Too bad. It's happening anyway. So you're providing arguments which I think for the most part are kind of inane. Multiple browsers are doing this independently. There was an argument there for quite some time from people, I know Mike and Burton know who I'm talking about, but certain people who argued that it was like a Google conspiracy theory pushing HTTPS. And now here we are like looking at Firefox forcing it. And Mozilla has done a lot of work in that direction for many years as well. If you don't like it, too bad. Like, literally go and roll your own browser. Trent says you have to accept the warning, which is a pain for captive portals. It is just a once-off each time you join that portal, though. Steven says Pi-hole is a good example of local and needing HTTP. Of course, you could put a certificate on your local Pi-hole. Scott's written a lot about this in the past as well. Here we go. You just said that a little bit further down. So, yes. Mike's referring to HTTPS naysayers as Luddites. I once chimed into an anti-HTTPS thread and referred to them as flat earthers. And then I got a lot of messages from flat earthers, which was entertaining, don't get me wrong. But wow, there's some crazies out there. If you're looking for something to keep you entertained during your lockdown periods or isolation within various parts of the world, go and watch Behind the Curve on Netflix about flat earthers. It's just absolutely hilarious. It's fascinating. Okay, last thing that I'm going to talk about here is the last blog post from yesterday. Why no HTTPS, the 2021 version? So this is a project that Scott and I have run for a few years where back in 2018 originally, we said, let's get a list together of all of the top 1 million websites that don't automatically redirect HTTP to HTTPS, and we'll put them on a big shame list, which is whynohttps.com. And it'll be kind of interesting. And then we broke it down by country as well. So you can see like the largest ones in Australia or South Sudan or wherever that don't implement HTTPS by default. And to be clear, what we're talking about here is not whether or not you have a certificate on the site, but whether or not you're redirecting HTTP to HTTPS ideally with a 301, or we will take a 302, or I think a 307, 308 as well. But normally what you would do is you'd say 301 permanent redirect with a location header, which then has an HTTPS address in it. Now, this data comes from Scott's crawler. He does a nightly crawl of the top 1 million websites based on the Tranco list. Blog post here explains what that is. And he puts it in his big list. We updated it, I think it was like December 2019. And then just this week, I just felt like doing something completely different to all the other stuff, so I thought I'd update it. So I pushed this out yesterday. And now we have a list here on whynohttps.com of the world's largest websites not doing HTTPS by default. Now, I guess there's a couple of interesting things about this. I was going to say, let's start with the good bits. So the good bit is that each time we do this, the list on the front page of the top 1 million websites gets further and further and further down the order. So to get 100 websites that are not redirecting to HTTPS, we need a sample size of the world's largest 1,803 websites. Now, before this, I think it was like the world's 1,500 or something like that. And then as we drill down, we get to different countries and then the different sites that don't redirect properly. Going and looking at the top 10. Well, isn't this interesting? Everything is either China or the US, all the way through to rednet.cn. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So the top 14 websites in the world that don't redirect to HTTPS are either US or Chinese. Now, stuff like Baidu. Baidu is China's Google, as they refer to it. If you go there over HTTP, we'll stick there in HTTP. But it's China. We've discussed they have a different view to privacy, haven't we? Some of the US ones are really interesting. Stuff like W3, w3.org. If you go to w3.org, you're going to see some. Here's where it gets a little bit nuanced. Depends on how you go there. So I just went to w3.org in my web browser and I see a padlock. But if I open up a console and I do a curl to w3.org, I get a 301 moved permanently to http://www.w3.org, and I get the content returned over the insecure scheme. Now, I suspect what happens is that there's probably like a meta refresh tag or a JavaScript or something like that, which then redirects you after that. So part of the problem here, and I'm sure this is part of the feedback in the comments on the blog post, I'm yet to read all of them, is that different websites will behave differently to people from different parts of the world, different UA strings. It will also appear to behave differently in terms of redirects based on whether it's doing it with response headers or content in the body. If you're curling, you can have curl follow redirects, no problems at all. But that's going to follow redirects where there are response headers with a location defined which tells the client to go to somewhere else. It's not going to follow a meta tag or a JavaScript file or a JavaScript redirect or something like that. So we get a bit of inconsistency here. We also get a bit of inconsistency around things like what country a website belongs to. Now, sometimes it's clear. If it's the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, it is Australian. Now, we can tell that both from the TLD, and we can also tell that by going to an API on Alexa, which I won't say we scrape, we grab some data from. An API on Alexa we grab some data from, which maps a domain to a country. Some of them are a little bit odd. I'm not sure, for example, that example.com is actually Indian. I don't know why Alexa says that, but I also don't know where else it would be, because it has a bit of an ambiguous TLD. It's not an American TLD, it's an international TLD, just putting it out there. So that could come from somewhere completely different. Now, I have sort of said to people, look, if you have corrections, and please drop them in here. I see there's a few, but I am sure also that when I sit here and I go and I curl those same URLs, we're going to get this behavior, which is you get one thing in your part of the world and I get this other thing, which really justifies them being on the list, because if they can't consistently redirect HTTP to HTTPS no matter where they are, then yeah, they deserve a place on the list. Okay, going to have a look at some of the comments here, because I can see a heap of them flying through here. What else we got? Stephen says, I wonder if anti-HTTP are related to anti-vax. I'm pretty sure, yes, in many cases. Lars says, what about the amazing live stream you did on home automation this week? All right, it's off topic, but we'll give Lars a plug as well. So Lars and I did a live stream on Monday. It's Friday morning, our time here. We did it Monday evening about IoT, and we both shared a bunch of stuff on screen as well. Go and check that out in our respective Twitter threads. I thought it was fun. We should do that again, Lars. Trent says, search engines often lower your SEO ranking if you do not do a 301 from HTTP to HTTPS, but 302 is better than none. There was a period, particularly many years ago, must be like 5 to 10 years ago, where Google started saying, we're going to give your SEO a little bump if you have HTTPS. Now, it was never entirely clear how much of a bump they gave you. And at the time, it was like, is this just trying to drive people to HTTPS? Or are they just that little bit more confident that when they actually request content over HTTPS, they're getting the real content? Certainly not a bad thing, whichever way you look at it. Stephen says, wonder what HIBP is ranked these days. It was in the single-digit thousands. I think it was like 6,000 or something like that. The Trenko list is available for everyone to download. Someone here says HTTPS on Baidu is probably same as HTTP. I wonder, does Baidu actually have a certificate? Can you request it over HTTPS? Well, here's an interesting question. So yes, you can request it over HTTPS. Controversial. How will the Chinese government look at increasing efforts to default all traffic to HTTPS from Firefox and Chrome? Interesting. Big Pod says, just found a Slovenian website that uses a script to go to HTTPS. Yeah, and in fact, I put an example in my blog post here where, was it Lush? Yeah, it's Lush that does this. So Lush.com will return HTTP 200 for a request to the naked domain over the insecure scheme. And then the response body literally has script, window.location. Replace it with www over HTTPS, www.lush.com. And then it's got some no script that says, this is not even a meta tag. So this is dependent on either running JavaScript, or if you're not running JavaScript, then clicking on the link that's exposed in the no script HTML tag. This is shitty. Don't do this. Now, incidentally as well, there are a bunch of sites which have returned 403. Now, they return 403 over HTTP, and some people might say, well, that shouldn't put them on the list. It's 403. But they're still returning a response over the insecure scheme and leaving you there. And that's the problem. They're not properly redirecting you to a page and then 403ing you over HTTPS. If they 403 it over HTTPS, fine, you get off the list. Someone this morning on Twitter said, look, W3 is actually HSTS preloaded. And I went to the HSTS preload page and they weren't. And what's interesting is they seem to be, and we can check this on the fly here, if we go to W3, and I just go to DevTools, w3.org, network tab, reload the page. What have they got here? They have a strict transport security header with the preload keyword and include subdomains. But they've got two problems here. So one is that their max age looks like 6 months to me. I'm just basing this off the number of seconds. You've got to have at least 1 year if you want to preload. The other problem is they're not returning this response header from the naked domain name, only from the www, which is really weird because W3 kind of feels like the sort of entity that should be able to get an open standard like this right. I don't know. Odd thing. What else is in here? Tried MS Edge and Dev screen, showed 307 to HTTPS with reason HSTS, which is good. 307 with an HSTS is what we want. Incidentally as well, since we're just talking about browsers defaulting to HTTPS, we are now starting to head to the point where eventually this HSTS preload list will become irrelevant, other than the fact at the moment it will force you to stay, at least in Chrome, if you try and go to a website over HTTP and it is in the HSTS preload list, you cannot do it at all over HTTP. So that's one little edge case where it's still valid. But over time, I don't think so. Lars got a plug. Lars happy. Dash in username says, what's the cert authority on Baidu? Oh, that is a really interesting question. So who issues the cert for Baidu? Over there in HTTPS, certificate, global sign. There you go. It is a global sign certificate. Yeah, so there you go. It's not some Chinese cert. Global sign is not Chinese, is it? And now he's deleted those comments. All right, well, we got the answer, Mike, any thoughts on HTTP 3 coming along so soon after 2, off-piste? I need to spend more time reading about it. I do not know enough about that to give any good insight whatsoever to that at the moment, mate. Off topic, what tennis racket do you use? First time I found a head MPs. I've got a Babolat, what is it, the yellow one? Babolat Airblade. I can't remember. All I remember, I was looking at the other day going, well, this racket's now several years old and has gone through many, many strings, but maybe that's time. I don't know, have tennis rackets gotten any better in the last 3 years? I think on that note, we're getting off topic now. There's a question here, is HLBP HSTS preloaded? What do you think? All of my things are HSTS preloaded right from day one. On that note, I'm going to wrap it up here. Burton's asking about home repair stuff. I'll talk about that next week. We're mostly done other than some of the stuff in here. This will look different probably next month now. I just need a bit of a break from, frankly, living in a construction zone. Thanks very much for watching the extra controversial version this week, and I'll come to you next week. See you, folks.